The first sign that something was wrong did not come from Washington. It did not come from London. It did not even come from the sea. It came from Tehran itself. In the early hours before dawn, when the city's power centers normally breathed with quiet certainty, something fundamental shifted. Streets around the most sensitive districts felt different, not louder, not locked down, simply thinner, as if authority itself had stepped back from the surface of the city. Security convoys moved without ceremony. Schedules vanished from internal calendars. Doors that were never closed remained sealed longer than usual. And then the whisper began to circulate inside the system, carefully, reluctantly, and without confirmation. The supreme leader was no longer in the capital, not relocated publicly, not appearing via broadcast, not symbolically present, gone. In Iran's political architecture, the capital is not just a city, it is a nerve center, a place where symbolism and command overlap. When the leader vanishes from that space, even temporarily, it is not interpreted as travel. It is interpreted as threat response. And threat response, by definition, implies danger has crossed a threshold. Inside Tehran's inner circles, officials did not use the word flee. They never would. The language was procedural, secure relocation, continuity measures, protective movement. But the effect was the same. The capital had been decentered. Power had moved underground, literally and figuratively. That alone would have been enough to rattle the system. But it did not happen in isolation. Across the Atlantic, a very different message was beginning to form, not delivered softly, not buried in diplomatic nuance, but framed in the unmistakable cadence of pressure. Donald Trump had begun urging Britain to align openly with a potential strike posture against the IRGC. Not a suggestion, not a private consultation, an urge. In geopolitical terms, urging an ally to join a strike is not about immediate action. It is about narrowing options. It is about transforming theoretical pressure into coalition pressure. It is about signaling that restraint may soon give way to alignment. And when alignment is mentioned publicly, the clock starts ticking. For Iran, the convergence was impossible to ignore. A disappearing leader, a tightening coalition, a naval posture already leaning forward. This was not yet war, but it was no longer peace. Inside Tehran, ministries functioned as they always had, on the surface. Offices opened, communications flowed, public messaging remained calm. But behind that surface, a different reality was unfolding. Decision-making slowed dramatically, not because people did not know what to do, but because no one wanted to be the one to do it. In systems built around centralized authority, initiative without explicit blessing is dangerous. Every official understood the same truth. If something went wrong now, history would not forgive guesswork. So hesitation set in. Meetings ran long, language became cautious, orders narrowed in scope. The absence of the leader created a vacuum, not of power, but of confidence. And confidence is the lubricant of state machinery. Without it, everything grinds. At the same time, the idea that Britain might join a strike coalition sent shockwaves through Tehran's strategic calculations. Britain was not just another Western voice, it was legitimacy. It was precedent. It was a bridge between American force and European restraint. If Britain aligned openly, the pressure would no longer be bilateral. It would be collective. Inside Iran's security apparatus, analysts recalculated deterrence models in real time. What had once been framed as a U.S. or Iran standoff now threatened to become something broader, something harder to manage diplomatically. Coalitions are harder to deter than single actors, because coalitions distribute risk. The IRGC, long positioned as both shield and sword of the regime, suddenly became the focal point of potential confrontation, not abstractly, explicitly. A strike against the IRGC would not be symbolic. It would be structural. And structural strikes trigger existential thinking. This is why panic, real panic, does not look like chaos. It looks like silence. Inside Tehran, communication tightened. Not more messages, fewer. Information was compartmentalized aggressively. Internal briefings emphasized control, discipline, and restraint. But restraint is harder to maintain when the center is missing. Without the leader present, senior figures began operating in parallel rather than hierarchy. Military commanders coordinated readiness. Political figures managed messaging. Clerical authorities focused on legitimacy. Each domain acted responsibly, but not cohesively. Cohesion requires a center. The streets of Tehran remained calm, but the atmosphere felt different. People sensed it, not through announcements, but through absence. Absence of familiar symbols, absence of certainty. When the leader disappears from view, people do not ask, "Where is he?" They ask, "Why now?" And the answer they imagine is rarely comforting. Meanwhile, Washington's posture hardened. As inevitability, as the next logical step if Iran failed to adjust behavior, language matters. Urging removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is Iran's greatest defensive asset. Across London, policymakers listened carefully. Britain had long walked the line between alliance loyalty and strategic caution. Being urged publicly forced a recalibration. Silence could be interpreted as reluctance. Agreement could escalate beyond control. This dilemma was not lost on Tehran. The possibility that Britain might align openly with a strike narrative against the IRGC raised the specter of a legitimacy loss. Iran had long framed its conflict with the US as unilateral aggression. A British alignment would fracture that narrative. Narratives matter as much as missiles. Inside Iran's leadership circles, discussions turned darker. Not hysterical, but sober. If pressure continued to build externally while internal authority remained diffused, the regime risked being caught between paralysis and overreaction. Neither was survivable. The decision to move the leader out of the capital now made brutal sense, not as weakness, but as preservation. If strikes came, the capital would be symbolic. Removing the symbol reduced vulnerability, but it also sent a message that the threat was taken seriously, and that message traveled fast. Across regional capitals, intelligence assessments shifted tone. Allies began planning for contingencies. Markets adjusted quietly. Energy routes were reevaluated. Insurance premiums crept upward. These are not reactions to rumors. They are reactions to posture. At sea, U.S. naval assets continued to hold position, not charging forward, not retreating, holding. This was the most pressure-efficient posture available. Holding says, "We are ready when you decide." For Iran, this was suffocating. Without centralized authority visibly present, every external signal felt amplified. Every statement from Washington carried more weight. Every whisper from London felt consequential. Inside the IRGC itself, readiness increased, but with caution. Missile units aligned, air defenses sharpened, cyber units activated. But no overt escalation occurred. Because escalation without authority is suicide, this is the paradox of power vacuums under pressure. They make states both more dangerous and less decisive at the same time. As days passed, the absence of the leader from Tehran became normalized internally, but not psychologically. Officials adapted procedurally, but the anxiety did not dissipate. It merely settled deeper. The capital functioned, but it no longer anchored. The capital felt like a stage without its central actor. Externally, Trump's pressure campaign continued to reverberate. The idea of Britain joining a strike was discussed, debated, dissected across global media ecosystems. Each discussion narrowed Iran's perceived options. Perception is reality in deterrence. Iran's leadership understood that if Britain aligned, restraint would become politically harder for Washington to maintain. Coalition dynamics pushed toward action. That is why the regime's reaction was not outward aggression, but internal lockdown. Not a lockdown of streets, a lockdown of decision-making. The government became conservative to the point of inertia. Risk was avoided at all costs. The objective was survival, not pride, but survival under constant pressure is exhausting. By the end of this phase, one truth had become undeniable inside Tehran. The crisis was no longer about a single strike or a single leader. It was about whether the system could function under simultaneous external convergence and internal dissentering. That is a rare test, and history is unforgiving when systems fail it. The leader's absence from the capital was not chaos, it was preparation. Trump's urging of Britain was not war, it was alignment pressure. Together, they created something far more dangerous than conflict. They created momentum, and momentum, once established, does not wait for permission. This was the opening act, not of war, but of something far harder to control. Panic does not explode, it compresses. Inside Iran, the second phase of the crisis did not unfold through riots, defections, or dramatic announcements. It unfolded through narrowing corridors of choice. The leadership vacuum created by the supreme leader's absence from Tehran did not cause immediate disorder. It caused something far more dangerous, convergence. Every pressure point began pushing inward at the same time. Externally, the pressure came from alignment. Trump's urging of Britain did not need confirmation to have effect. The mere act of publicly encouraging a key ally to join a strike posture against the IRGC sent a clear message to Tehran. The conflict was no longer framed as bilateral leverage, it was being reframed as collective action. Collective action removes exit ramps. Inside Iran's strategic circles, this realization landed heavily. Coalition dynamics changed the logic of deterrence. A single adversary can be negotiated with, delayed, or outlasted. A coalition introduces reputational cost, diplomatic isolation, and accelerated timelines. Coalitions move faster than diplomacy can adapt. This meant Iran-AS leadership, already operating without its visible center, had to reassess every assumption it held about escalation control. At the same time, the U.S. fleet's posture remained unchanged. No surge, no retreat, just presence. The most unnerving kind. Presence creates inevitability. It communicates that decisions will have consequences regardless of intention. Inside Tehran, senior officials began to recognize that panic was not the danger. Panic is loud. Panic draws attention. Panic burns itself out. Compression squeezes options until the smallest misstep becomes irreversible. Meetings inside Iran's highest councils grew shorter but more frequent, not because consensus was reached, but because consensus was impossible. Every participant carried the same unspoken awareness. Without the supreme leader physically present, no one could impose finality. This created a form of distributed anxiety. Military commanders focused on readiness but avoided visible escalation. Intelligence chiefs flooded decision-makers with analysis but stopped short of recommendations. Political figures crafted messages that said everything and nothing at the same time. Everyone moved, no one advanced. This paralysis was not incompetence. It was rational behavior inside an irrational environment. The IRGC, suddenly placed at the center of international strike rhetoric, became both shield and liability. Historically, the organization thrived on confrontation narratives. External threats justified internal cohesion. But this time felt different. A strike coalition against the IRGC would not be symbolic. Escalation could justify the strike. Restraint could invite it anyway. Inside IRGC command rooms, readiness increased, but invisibly. Air defense systems hardened coverage. Cyber divisions intensified monitoring. Everything happened below the threshold of visibility. Visibility would be interpreted as provocation. But invisibility came with its own cost, uncertainty. Externally, the world watched Iran's response with heightened sensitivity. Markets reacted not to events, but to tone. Energy prices twitched. Shipping insurers recalculated exposure. Regional states adjusted alert levels quietly. None of this required confirmation of a strike. It required belief that the system was under strain. The supreme leader's continued absence from Tehran reinforced that belief. The longer it persisted, the more it reshaped perception. What began as a precaution increasingly looked like displacement, and displacement carries meaning. It suggests expectation of impact. Inside Iran's population, awareness spread unevenly, not through official channels, but through intuition. People noticed unusual security patterns. They noticed the absence of familiar faces from state broadcasts. They noticed the hesitation in official language. Governments communicate fear not through words, but through caution. The result was a subtle tightening of public behavior. People spoke more quietly. Businesses delayed decisions. Travel slowed. This was not mass panic. It was anticipatory restraint. Anticipation is dangerous because it feeds speculation. Speculation feeds pressure. Pressure feeds compression. Meanwhile, Trump's messaging continued to resonate beyond Washington. Britain's silence became a signal in itself. Silence under urging is not neutral. It suggests deliberation. Deliberation implies possibility. Iran's analysts understood this instantly. If Britain said yes, even implicitly, the diplomatic architecture would shift overnight. European reluctance would fracture. International legitimacy for action against the IRGC would expand. That expansion terrified Tehran more than missiles ever could, because legitimacy lasts longer than explosions. Inside Iran's foreign policy apparatus, emergency outreach intensified. Quiet reassurances were sent. Warnings were issued through intermediaries. The message was consistent. Escalation would have consequences far beyond the region. But warnings carry less weight when issued from a system whose center is unseen. Credibility requires presence. At sea, U.S. naval commanders sensed the tightening environment. They adjusted operations subtly, not to escalate, but to avoid misinterpretation. Aircraft launches were minimized. Communication discipline tightened further. The goal was not to provoke. The goal was to wait. Waiting under compression is terrifying. For Iran, every hour without clarity increased internal stress. The leadership vacuum forced adaptation, but adaptation under threat is exhausting. Officials began operating on contingency logic rather than strategy. Contingency logic is short-term, strategy is long-term. The loss of long-term framing is a hallmark of panic. Inside Tehran, that characterization felt both unfair and dangerous. It was over-controlled. Every action required multiple confirmations. Every decision passed through layers of caution. The system insulated itself against error, but in doing so, it slowed dangerously. Slowness under external pressure is not safety, it is exposure. The IRGC's internal posture reflected this contradiction. Units remained ready, but commanders avoided initiative. Doctrine emphasized defense, not deterrence. The organization braced itself, not for war, but for shock. Shock comes when compressed systems fail suddenly. Meanwhile, the supreme leader remained absent from public view. No images. If the leader were confident, he would appear. That assumption, fair or not, became widespread. Inside Iran, senior clerics began preparing for extended absence scenarios. Not succession, but substitution. How to maintain legitimacy without visibility? These are not questions stable systems ask lightly. They are questions asked when history presses close. The pressure from Trump's coalition messaging continued to reverberate. The idea that Britain might join a strike against the IRGC narrowed Iran. S perceived diplomatic escape routes. Every path now led through uncertainty. Iran could escalate, but that could unify the coalition. Iran could restrain, but that could be interpreted as weakness. Iran could negotiate, but from what position and through whom? The missing center haunted every option. By the end of this phase, panic had not erupted, but compression had reached its limit. The system was no longer absorbing pressure, it was storing it. Stored pressure does not dissipate quietly, it releases. And release, when it comes, is rarely controlled. This was the moment before release. The moment when everyone involved sensed that the situation could not remain suspended much longer. Something would give, not because anyone wanted it to, but because compressed systems always do. By the third phase, the pressure inside Iran had stopped arriving from outside. It was now being generated internally. This is the point most systems fail to recognize until it is too late. External threats are manageable when authority is clear. Internal uncertainty is not. Once a system begins reacting to its own fear, every signal becomes amplified, every delay suspicious, every decision provisional. Iran had crossed into that phase. The disappearance of the supreme leader from Tehran was no longer treated as a temporary adjustment. It had become an operational reality. The system was now speaking to itself, interpreting its own movements, second-guessing its own signals, reacting to shadows cast by its own hesitation. That self-interaction is where panic matures. Inside Tehran's power structure, senior officials began to notice a shift in tone, not in public messaging, but in private exchanges. Conversations that once focused on strategy now centered on interpretation. What does Washington think this means? How will London read that silence? Will restraint be seen as calculation or fear? These questions did not advance policy, they consumed it. The system had entered a loop. Military commanders reported readiness updates that changed nothing. Intelligence agencies produced assessments that contradicted each other in nuance rather than substance. Political figures revised statements repeatedly before releasing versions so neutral they said almost nothing. This was not confusion, it was self-containment. The system was protecting itself from making the wrong move by making no move at all. Externally, this behavior was being watched closely. From Washington's perspective, the absence of decisive Iranian response was being read as strain, not weakness, but constraint. Constraint created opportunity. It suggested that Iran's leadership was struggling to align internally. That perception mattered. Because pressure strategies do not require certainty. They require belief that time favors the pressuring side. Trump's earlier urging of Britain now played a different role. It had already done its primary work. It had forced alignment into the conversation. Now it lingered as a background threat, an unspoken escalation lever that could be pulled at any moment. Britain's continued deliberation was not reassuring to Tehran. It was unnerving. Deliberation means calculation. Calculation means contingency planning. Contingency planning means readiness for outcomes that include force. Inside Iran's foreign policy apparatus, officials tried to reassert narrative control. Messages emphasized sovereignty, deterrence, and resilience. But internally, they understood the problem was not messaging. It was coherence. Without visible central authority, every institution was optimizing for its own survival. That optimization did not always align with national strategy. The IRGC, under direct rhetorical pressure, adopted a posture of maximum discipline. No unauthorized movements, no provocative exercises, no rhetorical escalation. This restraint was intentional. But restraint, when observed by an adversary, can be misread. Restraint can look like paralysis, and paralysis invites probing. Inside U.S. planning circles, analysts debated whether Iran's behavior signaled preparation or fear. The answer mattered. Preparation suggests deterrence. Fear suggests opportunity. The ambiguity itself was destabilizing. At sea, naval commanders continued their measured posture. They were acutely aware that any sudden movement could be interpreted as exploitation of Iran's internal uncertainty. That interpretation could trigger exactly the escalation they sought to avoid. So the fleet waited. Waiting under these conditions was not passive. It was pressure applied through time. Back in Tehran, the population felt the weight of the moment more clearly now. Not through dramatic events, but through subtle cues. Government offices closed earlier. Travel advisories circulated quietly. Banks tightened procedures. Rumors spread faster than official clarification. When the state grows quiet, society listens harder. Inside Iran's clerical establishment, conversations turned increasingly introspective. The absence of the supreme leader from the capital raised theological as well as political questions. Authority in Iran is not merely administrative. It is symbolic, spiritual, and historical. Some clerics framed the absence as wisdom, protection of the state's most important figure. Others worried that prolonged invisibility weakened the very symbolism it sought to protect. Symbols must be seen to function. Political legitimacy is not maintained solely through force or law. Meanwhile, Iran's regional posture grew quieter. Proxy networks that once acted with initiative now awaited explicit guidance. Without it, operations slowed. The region entered a strange lull, not because tensions eased, but because signals stopped flowing. This lull was dangerous. It created space for misinterpretation by all sides. Externally, analysts noted the silence and debated its meaning. Was Iran regrouping? Was it preparing for a sudden response? Or was it simply struggling to coordinate? The lack of clarity increased pressure on Washington to maintain readiness without provoking. Inside Iran, that same lack of clarity increased pressure to maintain restraint without appearing passive. Both sides were trapped in mirrored dilemmas. The system was now balancing on perception rather than action. As days accumulated, fatigue became a factor. Decision-makers operating under sustained uncertainty began to simplify. Complex strategies give way to heuristics. Nuance erodes. Binary thinking creeps in. This is when systems make mistakes. The Iranian government attempted to counter this by tightening internal discipline further. Fewer voices in meetings, more centralized review of communications, higher thresholds for approval. These measures stabilize messaging, but at the cost of speed. Speed matters when external pressure remains constant. Trump's posture continued to loom over calculations. Even without new statements, the earlier urging of Britain hung in the background as a reminder that escalation could be internationalized rapidly. This reminder forced Tehran to consider worst-case scenarios more seriously. What if Britain aligned? What if European restraint fractured? What if diplomatic isolation accelerated? These questions circled endlessly. Without a visible leader to impose direction, they remained questions. At sea, sailors and officers felt the duration of the standoff more than its intensity. Long deployments under constant awareness drain morale subtly. Nothing happens, yet everything matters. That tension requires discipline to maintain. The U.S. fleet maintained it. Iran's system struggled to do the same, not because it lacked capability, but because it lacked closure. Closure does not require resolution. It requires direction. The supreme leader's continued absence deprived the system of that direction. Even if communication existed behind the scenes, the lack of public presence mattered. Public presence reassures institutions as much as citizens. By the end of this phase, the crisis had transformed again. It was no longer defined by movement or statements. It was defined by feedback loops. Iran was reacting to how it thought others perceived its reaction. The U.S. and its allies were reacting to how they thought Iran perceived their restraint. Everyone was reacting to perception. Perception, when untethered from clear authority, becomes unstable. This instability did not produce explosions. It produced fragility. And fragility under sustained pressure is the most dangerous condition of all, because when fragile systems finally move, they rarely do so gently, they snap. This was the moment before the snap, the moment when silence grew heavy enough to bend outcomes, the moment when the system began whispering to itself louder than any external threat. The final phase did not begin with the leader's return. It began with the system accepting that return might not restore what had been lost. For days, Iran had existed in a state of suspended authority. Not collapse, not chaos. Something far more dangerous. Self-management under pressure. Institutions functioned, orders moved, security held. But the invisible thread that once tied every decision to a single center had frayed. Now, that fraying had consequences. Inside Tehran, senior officials no longer waited for clarity. They acted within narrow lanes, carefully defined and aggressively protected. The state had adapted, but adaptation under stress changes behavior permanently. This was the moment when survival instincts hardened into doctrine. When whispers began circulating that the supreme leader might soon reappear, either symbolically or physically, the reaction inside the system was not relief. It was calculation. Would his return stabilize things? Or would it expose how much had already shifted? Because power does not simply resume its old shape after absence. It re-enters a system that has learned how to function without it. That learning cannot be undone. Externally, the pressure environment had not eased. Trump's earlier urging of Britain continued to echo through strategic circles, even without repetition. The signal had already been sent. The idea of coalition escalation against the IRGC had entered the bloodstream of global decision-making. That idea could not be recalled. Britain's continued deliberation remained unresolved, and that unresolved state was itself destabilizing. Tehran understood that Britain's choice would not be announced loudly. It would be signaled through posture, silence, and timing. Signals are how modern conflict moves. Inside Iran's leadership structure, officials began preparing for two futures simultaneously, one in which the leader returned visibly, reasserting symbolic authority, and one in which his absence continued long enough to normalize decentralization. Both futures carried risk. A visible return might reassure the public, but it would also invite scrutiny. Why now? Why after days of silence? What had changed? The return itself could be read as reaction rather than control. Continued absence, on the other hand, would cement the perception of vulnerability. There was no safe option. At the same time, the IRGC faced its own reckoning. For decades, it had positioned itself as both guardian and enforcer of the regime's continuity. Now, with international pressure focusing explicitly on it, the organization had become a liability as well as a shield. This was a dangerous identity shift. Inside IRGC command rooms, leaders assessed worst-case scenarios not in terms of battlefield outcomes, but institutional survival. A coalition strike would not aim to defeat Iran militarily. It would aim to fracture the regime's internal balance. That realization forced restraint into overdrive. The IRGC did not escalate, but it did prepare for shock. Across Iran's cities, the public mood shifted again, not toward panic, but toward resignation. People sensed that something fundamental had changed, even if no single event explained it. Trust and predictability weakened. Confidence in continuity softened. This erosion was subtle, but erosion reshapes landscapes permanently. In Tehran, symbolic gestures began appearing. Not grand announcements, but carefully staged signs of stability. Senior officials appeared more frequently. Military leaders issued calm statements. Clerics emphasized endurance. The message was consistent. The system holds. But behind the message lay an uncomfortable truth. The system had been tested, and it had learned things it could not unlearn. Externally, U.S. naval posture remained unchanged. The fleet continued to hold position with disciplined patience. That patience now carried a different meaning. It was no longer simply pressure. It was observation. The fleet was watching how Iran stabilized itself, watching which institutions filled gaps, watching which voices gained influence, watching how the regime recalibrated after absence. Observation is intelligence, and intelligence shapes future pressure. Inside Washington, planners recognized that this moment was no longer about immediate confrontation. It was about long-term leverage. The disappearance of Iran-S leader from the capital and the System-S reaction to it had revealed internal dynamics that would inform strategy for years. This was no longer a crisis. It was a data point. For Iran, that realization was sobering. The leadership vacuum had not led to overthrow or collapse, but it had exposed fault lines between speed and control, between symbolism and function, between central authority and institutional inertia. Those fault lines would not close automatically. As the possibility of the leader's reappearance grew more concrete, internal debates sharpened. Some argued that visibility was essential to restore deterrence. Others warned that returning too visibly could invite further pressure. Visibility attracts challenge, but invisibility breeds doubt. The regime stood at a crossroads of perception. When limited signs of the leader's continued command began to surface, indirect, controlled, minimal, the effect was muted. There was no surge of relief, no emotional reset. The system acknowledged it, adjusted slightly, and moved on. That reaction revealed everything. The center had returned, but the weight had redistributed. This redistribution marked the true end of the crisis. Not because danger passed, but because adaptation solidified. Externally, Trump's pressure campaign began to plateau. Britain's position remained carefully ambiguous. The immediate risk of coalition escalation did not materialize, but it did not disappear either. The threat remained dormant. Dormant threats shape behavior more than active ones. Iran's leadership accepted this reality. The goal shifted from dominance to endurance, from deterrence through bravado to deterrence through control. Messaging became more disciplined. Actions became more calculated. The IRGC repositioned itself quietly, less rhetorical, more procedural. The organization internalized the lesson that visibility could be vulnerability under coalition scrutiny. Across the region, actors recalibrated. Allies adjusted expectations. Proxies awaited clearer signals. Everyone recognized that Iran's margin for error had narrowed, and the world moved on. But the system remembered. The disappearance of the leader from the capital would not be remembered as flight or fear inside Iran, Tawhid's official history. It would be framed as prudence, as preparation, as continuity under threat. But privately, those who lived through it would remember something else. They would remember how quickly certainty evaporated, how silence reshaped authority, how pressure exposed structure. They would remember that power is not just about command, it is about presence. And presence, once broken, never fully returns in the same form. The crisis ended without war, without strikes, without declarations, without collapse. But it left residue. Residue in doctrine, residue in perception, residue in how future confrontations will be interpreted. For Iran, the lesson was stark. Centralized power creates clarity, but also fragility. When the center disappears, even temporarily, the system must evolve or fracture. For the U.S. and its allies, the lesson was equally clear. Pressure works best when it does not demand immediate reaction. Time, ambiguity, and observation can extract more leverage than force. It aged, and aged systems behave differently. As the world shifted its attention elsewhere, the memory of this moment embedded itself into strategic planning rooms, intelligence assessments, and institutional instincts on all sides. Because everyone involved understood the same truth, the most dangerous phase of modern conflict is not the moment of attack. It is the moment when power hesitates, pressure converges, and the system is forced to reveal how it functions under absence. This time, Iran held. But it held differently than before, and the world noticed.